starts having dreams, and we are going to look obviously at what God is up to, what's happening, the beginning of a great historical event in the history of the world. Joseph, an extraordinary man of God, but also a man who has come out of an incredibly dysfunctional family. I joke around that it's like a soap opera. It is, but these guys were dysfunctional, and there was enough blame to go around to the brothers of Joseph, to his dad Israel, or Jacob as we usually call him. And so we're going to take a look today, and then kind of set the stage a few weeks from now when we're getting together. We'll get on Joseph being used by God to rescue Egypt, and in doing so his own people. So Kara Ann is going to be our reader tonight, and why don't you just start reading chapter 37, verse 1, and I'll just holler when I want you to stop.
Yes, sir. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended to his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives Bilhah and Zilpah, but Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him.
Okay. So let's just start unwrapping the dysfunction here. So he's 17 years old. He is Dad's favorite. Any idea why he was favorite? Yeah, because of his mother. And who was his mother? Rachel. And just think again about the dynamics. And we did look at this before, but he loved Rachel. He didn't love Leah. There were two servants involved in bearing children. It really is a perfect scenario, perfect storm scenario. Also, he gets this richly ornamented robe. Let's talk about clothing for a minute. Clothing for you and I is a preference kind of thing. Clothing is cheap. It's probably never been so cheap to have clothing as now throughout much of the world. We live in a very consumer-oriented culture, and so how many pair of pants do you have? How many shirts do you have? How many shoes do you have? A person back then, for most of history, and what we would see Old Testament and New Testament, the average person owned two sets of clothes. Jesus said as he was teaching, if somebody demands your coat, give him your cloak also. So you didn't have much because everything was handmade. To tear when somebody was in grief and they would tear their clothing, that's a big deal. That's not just ripping something and I'll throw that one away or put that in the rag pile. It's a big, huge deal. For him to go buy his son something I can only guess it would have cost thousands of dollars. I dream about what it could have looked like. I don't really know. I watched. Anybody ever see Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? Okay. Younger folks here, did you ever see that? Okay. That was big in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, I think. And both my wife and myself were in the production, different productions, but we were both in the production. And so I have a memory of the person who played Joseph wearing the Technicolor Dreamcoat, the richly ornamented robe, and looked pretty cool. Of course, that was the 70s. A lot of weird things looked cool, like bell-bottom jeans and all kinds of dumb stuff. So, so he did that, and already there's a saying in my wife and I lived in eastern Lebanon County for 13 years, 14 years, and a lot of Pennsylvania, a lot of German culture out in eastern Pennsylvania, Amish, and one of the Pennsylvania Dutch things to say, how could you be so dumb? And I offer that to Jacob. How could you be so dumb to buy something for your son, and you've got 11 other sons that don't get anything? So he's already instigating a problem that just isn't going to go away. And it says in verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him, that being Joseph, more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Listen to the kind of descriptive words through this whole passage, particularly with the brothers, how angry they are. And they hated him, and they want to kill him. Well, horrible stuff. And it's not just words. Their father loved him more than any of them. They hated him, and he could not speak a kind word to him. Don't raise your hands. I'm not looking for anybody to comment, but how many of us here have maybe grown up, or maybe in your work environment experienced favoritism where somebody else was more favored than you were, or at least you felt that way? That happens a lot. And that's controlled a lot of people's lives. I would, Sue would make the dessert, and I would cut the dessert. And what my dad used to say when we cut the dessert, he said, make them all equal, just make mine more equal than everybody else's. So there is inside of us, God has placed this meter that reads injustice, personal injustice. I've been cheated. I've been ill-favored because I don't get it. Somebody else got more favor than I got. And we have within us this thing that wants to launch out and just make a scene. He got a bigger piece than I got. That is natural. I believe it is by God's design. It's fallen like the rest of our bodies are fallen and prone to sin, but we are hypersensitive to injustice. So these other brothers are fired up, and we'll see that even more. So to get this clothing, get this robe, would have cost a bundle. And it's just like, I know guys better than girls. If you had a bunch of brothers and they're all driving some old Chevy around, some old car that's just fallen apart, a Buick Century from the late 1990s, which I drove around for a while. And if your dad came out and gave your brother, you picked whatever car, I'll just say a Mustang GT with a convertible rooftop and the quick Shelby shift pattern on it. It gave that to your brother and didn't give you and your other brothers anything. After you got off over the shock of it, it would have just been an amazing thing. So, Kara Ann, let's keep reading.
Okay. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. His brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them.
Okay. Again, the Pennsylvania Dutch, how could you be so dumb? But to his defense, he's 17 years old. To his defense, I think he probably actually believed he was doing something good there by telling his brothers. Now, one of the things is we can talk about all these things from a human perspective. We're going to see God using them in the future for his purposes, and it's going to turn out in a way only God could do. Those kind of things don't happen by human effort, and some amazing things. But Joseph, I think, probably had an unrealistic view. This just be my guess interpreting. He probably thought his brothers down deep really liked him, but I don't think so. Carrie-Ann, keep reading.
Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. "Listen, I have had another dream," he said. "The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me." This time he told his dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. "What kind of dream is that?" he asked. "Will your mother-in-law and your brothers actually come to bow to the ground before you?" But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant.
Okay, so Joseph, how can you be so dumb? And Dad, you're going to bow down before me, you and Mom, someday in the future. It's just dysfunctional. But to be fair, Joseph was 17 years old. Maybe you can remember being 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and your perception of life and your lack of skill at maneuvering socially through life, thinking about others, and that happens to adults as well, but it really shines in adolescence. So we've got Joseph here, but he's also been conditioned to be Dad's favorite, and he's got this coat to remind everybody, and now he's got these dreams, and you're going to bow down before me. Just think about that. Think about, we all come from different family situations, but just think about that actually playing itself out and being one of the other brothers. Let's talk about jealousy and the word. But the father, his brothers were jealous of him. What is jealousy? I'm looking for answers here. What is jealousy? Okay. And can we throw in the word covet? Yeah. So when you're jealous, let's keep it relational. Somebody pays attention to your girlfriend, you get jealous. Is that all bad? Not necessarily. If my wife's here, if somebody paid attention to my wife and I didn't do anything about it, I'd be in trouble. Would that be fair to say? So there's aspects. God is a jealous God. There's aspects of jealousy that aren't wrong. Make that comparison to anger. Be angry and sin not. So that's a good thing. The reality, though, is we need to keep a tight leash on our anger, because anger is prone to leading us into sinful behavior. I think jealousy is the same way. Jealousy could be righteous. God is jealous for us, of us, paying attention to other gods, and so I think there's a place where we can be jealous, and it can be a good thing. But here it is not a good thing. When the Sanhedrin, the church leaders, brought after Pentecost in Acts, brought Peter and John and James and the disciples, and it said they were intensely jealous of the disciples, because the disciples were like rock stars. Everybody was paying attention to them and not the religious leaders, and so they were violently jealous. And jealousy needs to be understood in terms of violence, and I'm talking about unhealthy unhealthy jealousy. It needs to be understood in terms of violence. It's a poison. It's a spiritual condition. There's a famous radio preacher, Chuck Swindoll. You ever hear of Chuck Swindoll? That might be for us older generation. He was on WDAC, and he still might be. He's died and gone to be with the Lord. But he still might be on WDAC, just like we have a radio station. This is from down in Lancaster. And every day at 9:30, I think it was, he would come on and he would preach a half-hour sermon. They had a recording. And he was a guy, he's one of those guys who just had it together. He did. He loved God, had it together. And he shared in one of his sermons one time that he had a secret weakness that plagued him, and that was jealousy. He said every time he had a girlfriend, he would get jealous that all the other guys were trying to steal her away from him. So he gets married, figuring that's going to solve the problem, and it doesn't solve the problem. And he got to the point where he convinced himself that his wife was seeing another man. And so he would tail her. He would leave for work as an associate pastor at a church, and he would hide the car, and if she would go out and go, he would follow her around, and it almost ruined their marriage. And he said, unless he got help, it's incredibly destructive. And these guys are jealous, and let's not even assign blame at this point. Is it Joseph's fault? Yes. Is it their fault? Yes. Is it Dad's fault? Yes. I'm sure it was Mom's fault as well. But the whole thing of jealousy is just wicked. It sows destruction. It's got murderous intent, and these guys were jealous. They wanted Dad's approval. Just an observation raising kids. It was important to me that we didn't raise our kids in this kind of environment, that one felt like they got the short end of the stick. They got the smaller slice of pie. It probably happened. I'm sure it did. But I'm just thinking about it, as we raise them, we don't want them to experience those things. But when they start, and those things start, you can do everything right as a parent, and when it starts, it's the kind of thing that it's not reasonable. There are things that need to be dealt with, or bad things happen. That's the point I wanted to make. Bad things happen. It also says his brothers were jealous, but his father kept the matter in mind. Jacob was, there's a lot of bad stuff we're talking about here. Jacob was a spiritually sensitive man. I'm impressed with that. It's something that I think came through the generations. Abraham was a very spiritually sensitive man. He had his own mistakes and his own weaknesses. Isaac was a spiritually sensitive man. And I think Jacob has followed in his footsteps, because whenever he encounters God, he responds in faith. And Abraham responded in faith, Isaac responded in faith, so did Jacob, or Israel. So he kept the matter in mind. Kara Ann, if you could read verse 12 and following.
Yes. Soon after this, Joseph's brother went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. When they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing the sheep at Shechem. Get ready and I will send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. "Go and see how your brothers and the flocks are getting along," Jacob said. "Then come back and bring me a report." So Jacob sent him on his way, and Joseph traveled to Shechem from their home in the valley of Hebron. When he arrived there, a man from the area noticed him wandering around the countryside. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "I'm looking for our brothers," Joseph replied. "Do you know where they are pasturing their sheep?" "Yes," the man told him. "They have moved on from here, but I heard them say, 'Let's go on to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers to Dothan and found them there. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into the cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams.
Okay, let's start off there. Also, this is coming off of not just the coat, not just Dad's favoritism, but Joseph also gave a bad report of his brothers. And if you have brothers, you have sisters, what's one of the worst things in the world, whether you do it or you're on the giving end or receiving end, is tattling. Is going, Mom, he did this, and we just had Thanksgiving. We had kids from out of town, grandkids, and I have this memory that somebody at some point did that, and that brought back a lot of memories with my kids. And I can even remember myself when something wasn't fair. There just was this desire to tattle. Yet when you're on the receiving end, there is nobody worse in the world than a tattletale. And it's as bad as it gets. And here Joseph goes and gives a bad report. He tattles on his brothers. And so he goes and looking for him. Not a lot of information there. And so he gets down, verse 19. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. All right, there's about to be a change in this story, and we've got Reuben coming up, actually wanting to save his brother's life. And Reuben's the oldest, and then this struggle because they want to kill him, but then they start thinking of other things they could do. They started the fear of what they were actually about to do, I think, started to settle in a little bit, and they started to modify their plans. Let's talk about motive for a little bit. When we're Christians and we have the Holy Spirit, we study to show ourselves approved, we tend to think that the decisions we make, that our motive behind the decisions we make are good motives. And that's usually not the case. And also, we tend to think of our motives that are either 100% good or they're 100% bad. Well, that's like a television show. That's not real life. I think it's very difficult for us in our weakened state that we live in, our flesh is so weak, to have motivations that are absolutely purely good. And if it is, would be because of the grace of God. And I'm not downplaying making good choices. Joseph made good choices when he got to Egypt. He made good decisions, and God honored that. But usually our motives are mixed. They can be bad, just as they were here. But these guys, they wanted to kill his brother. They were insanely jealous. They were angry. They were ready to act, and they did act. But then they started to have a little bit of a change of heart for whatever reasons. And some of that may have just been simply the reality of what they were about to do started getting in their head. And do you know what a lynching is? You hear the term. We most associated with turn of the 19th to 20th century. In the South, there would be lynchings that when a crime was committed or supposedly committed from the black community upon the white community, they would find people, and the whole town at times would go out somewhere and they would lynch them. They would kill them. And read some interesting things from a Christian perspective, talking about that it's a group evil that goes on. And then this is true about other kinds of heinous crimes like that, is afterwards the people who did these things were just kind of blank. They just were in the stupor, and in a stupor, and they were just coming to the realization of what they had done. And the emotion of rage and kill really had started to go away. There were sanctuary cities. If you committed a crime, and it was like an unintentional crime, oftentimes, and somebody was killed, family would want to avenge that murder, and that was the way of the world, not the law of God, way of the world. But part of that sanctuary city was to be a place that the person who caused the accident, caused the harm, could run and would be protected from being killed until the other party could calm down. And you think about times when you've been enraged about something, you've been angry about something, and when you got anger, man, you got an energy. It feels good, but it doesn't last, and then you start to calm down, and then you come to your senses, and you think, wow, what is it I just about did? And I think that's something we're going to step into here. And a few characters are mentioned, Reuben and Judah. So I'll reread 19. Here comes that dreamer. They said to each other, come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. That'd be a well. And we find out the well doesn't have water. And say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Verse 21, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into a cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. Just interesting, Reuben was the oldest, and he was what he was. He was the one guy that wanted to rescue him. And I just think sometimes oldest child oftentimes feels like they need to be the responsible one. They're in charge. And middle child, I always said I have a younger sister and an older brother, and I said my parents made all their mistakes on my older brother and were too tired to raise my little sister and got it right with me. That's not really true, but makes me feel a little better. So he wants to rescue him. So even though he was, because he was part of the brothers, he was angry and jealous and wanting to do bad things. He either came to his senses or never lost his senses and wanted to rescue him. Verse 23, Kara Ann, would you want to read a bit?
Verse 23?
Yeah.
So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. Then, just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. In this group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Galilee down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, Midianite traders came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him for 20 pieces of silver, and the traders took him to Egypt.
Okay. Yeah. Verse 25, as they sat down to eat their meal, Joseph, right beside them, is in a cistern, and they're sitting there eating their meal. I think that's pretty cold. And Ishmaelite traders, they're my picture of Ishmaelite traders. They tend to ride camels because they're in the desert a lot.
Have a good day.
They're merchants. They are the early version of UPS and FedEx, not just for delivering, but they're bringing things from different cultures, things that can be used, things that are exotic, and also slave trade. Slave trade's been around since the beginning. I'm not trying to lessen how bad slave trade is, but slave trade has been around since the beginning. And so they're loaded down on their way to Egypt, and Egypt was the power. We'll see that Egypt was this. Up till this point, the majority of kingdoms were single cities, or a banding together of cities. Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah, Zoar, and Zeboim. They banded together because they were stronger together, and even though they would have had sizable armies for the day, to have that many armies joined together would have made them more powerful. And kingdoms like we're used to studying, like Rome, like Egypt, like Persia, Assyria, all the different places. They were kingdoms that went out through conquest and had vast territories. Under Solomon, the control of Israel over the area had really inflated. If you look at the size of the nation of Israel under King Solomon, because they were rich and they were powerful. And by conquering, they gained more and more wealth, and that's evidenced in a lot of the readings of how royalty lived. They lived in these palaces. One thing when I was over in Israel, the one thing that you really become aware of rapidly, that King Herod, who was really more of a governor, had this passion for building, and he basically enslaved a large percentage of population of wherever they were, brought them into slavery and used the slaves to build all these buildings. He reconstructed the temple. He built all kinds of amphitheaters and structures in different cities. I think of the hundreds of thousands of slaves who probably died building all those buildings that are in ruins now, but it's still fascinating what he accomplished. So just the wealth and the opulence that comes with that. So let's talk about Judah for just a second. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. This probably could be considered a softening of their tone and intention, a reality check. A reality check that would bring them to their senses a little bit. But I want to talk about Judah. Judah was a pretty bad guy. Yet, what tribe did Jesus come from? Judah, the Lion of Judah. And that's fascinating. So how did he get from here to there? And next week, we're going to be looking at, particularly at Judah, of how he became the leader of the pack. Because if I picked the leader of the pack, I would have picked Joseph, because he was such a righteous guy. And I remember as a young kid reading about Joseph, and the first time when I read through this stuff and I realized Judah was the one, I didn't understand, God, why'd you pick Judah? Beyond, that's what he decided, I can accept that. I don't have to understand it. But I think there are some clues that God has put in the scriptures, and we're going to look at that clue next week. And if I can give you a homework assignment, read and maybe reread chapter 38, and wonder what that has to do with the life of Judah and his tribe and nation, and how Jesus came from that, and how he affected the outcome of all this story, this dysfunctional story. So just some interesting things. If I can jump ahead just a second, read that and reread it, but it's interesting, if you look at the two chapters, or chapter before, you've got the life of Joseph, the story of Joseph unfolding. You get to chapter 38 and it stops, and it becomes the life of Judah, and then you get back to 39 and it's the life of Joseph again. So I think it's reasonable to assume that the strategic placing of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38 is there for a reason, sandwiched in between the story of Joseph and the continued story of Joseph. So keep all those things in mind, and we'll have a lot to talk about next week. So they do this, they agreed to do it. So when the Midianite merchants came by, the brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver, which is about 2/3 of a year's wages. So they took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. Remember, that's a big deal. So this is intense stuff going on here for Reuben. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And he got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe into the blood. And they took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see if it is your son's robe." They recognized it and said, he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him, and Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." And so his father wept for him. Wow. Can you imagine being a brother and slowly, but probably surely, this is experience here was rapidly, but they had to live with what they did. They had to live with what they did every day, year after year. It was settled, but it was never settled. Now, we get the miracle of God working in through this in a few weeks, but at this point, they have a father who's inconsolable. They never got what they wanted, their father's love. There's no way his father's going to pour out his love except on Benjamin. But what a tremendous, horrible thing to have to live through. And he tore his clothes. Reuben tore his clothes. Again, that's a sign. That's a huge deal. Sackcloth. Let's talk about sackcloth. What does it look like? Or what do you think it looks like?
A potato sack.
Yeah, like a potato sack.
Very rough.
Very rough. Any of us old timers know what a gunny sack is? Any of you young timers know what a gunny sack is? Boy, that's becoming more and more that I'm out of touch. What fabric is it made of, or material? Gunny sacks, hemp, right? It's natural. It's really rough. That's what I always think of when I think of sackcloth. But and then the whole deal is you put on sackcloth, you throw ashes, cold ashes over your whole body, shave your head if there's a vow involved, and sit out in your front yard and wail for 30 days. I shared this a few weeks ago. My Old Testament professor lived in Israel, and he said people still old-timers still grieve that way, and he thought it was a remarkably healthy way to deal with grief and loss. Because we kind of, in our culture, we kind of hold things in. We don't talk about it and hoping it'll go away, and it doesn't go away. And in Israel, they sit out and they wail cry for days, and they'll sit on the ground. And when they're done, they pack up, they go inside, they modern day get a shower and go on with life. And it's not that it doesn't affect them, but they get a lot of it out of their system. And there ought to be a study done from a Christian perspective is grieving Old Testament style. So his father grieved, but it's significant, and I'll go down to the grave in sadness, and he wept for him. So he did that. Can you imagine being the brothers and them? And you wouldn't. These guys weren't really believers, and obviously believing in Old Testament had similarities, but it was fulfilled in the New Testament in Jesus Christ. So, what a miserable way to live. Jacob never really recovered. It's interesting. You go from Abraham, who was a man of faith, you go to Isaac, who was a pretty negative person. I think it probably was. He probably had cataracts he couldn't see, and so it's important for me to try to understand him in the culture he lived in. We have so much. We still all die anyways, and our bodies are fragile. But both my parents have had cataracts removed from all four of their eyes, 2 eyes each, and that's a minor procedure that takes days to recover to weeks. I'm not sure. For some people, the results are pretty good. For some people, they're outstanding results, like they don't need glasses anymore. And but think about Isaac, and he couldn't see, and so his whole life he probably just sat around or laid around waiting to die. But he died at 160 years old, so he had a lot of life that probably wasn't too joyous, but he was faithful. Jacob also had, especially from this point on, was a sad fella. He lost his son, and there's just something interesting. Let's talk about grief. The interest in that is people are different when they lose a loved one, and the reasons are almost infinite. But some people get over, and it takes a while. I'm not trying to minimize, but there are some people who never get over a loss. And I think there's probably many reasons, but I think it probably has something to do with our beliefs. That to show that I loved my husband, to show that I loved my mother, I'm never, and they're not things we sit down and just reason out. They just kind of happen. That I'll show my love for whoever I've lost by never getting over it. And that's a theme of a lot of like Hallmark movies. Somebody who hasn't moved past the loss, and then something happens and they get past it. But this would be Jacob who couldn't get past it. He lost Joseph. We know the story. We're out of the story, looking down on the story, so it's hard for us to feel, to really feel what these guys are really going through. But in the morning I will go down to the grave to my son, so his father wept for him. One thing about the Bible is almost universal, and in looking at heaven is up, hell is down, death is down, Sheol is down, and paradise is up, God is up. Jesus ascended. When his ministry was done on earth, he ascended to heaven, went up on the clouds. Now, one of the things we do when we approach the scriptures, a question you should ask, and especially when you're in something like the book of Revelation, do I take what I see here literally or figuratively? Anybody know how do you deal with those kind of things? My motive out of this passage is, in mourning my head, I will go down to the grave. The sons of Korah rebelled against Moses. God opened up the ground and they went down to Sheol. So is it literally down and up? Or is that just metaphor? Any thoughts? It's good to ask the questions. The answers we may get or not. I tend to be more literal. There is a movement called hyper-literal. I'm not there, But how do you know to take something, let's the book of Revelation, for example. How do you know if you take something literally or figuratively? And I think the answer is, and if this is impressive, it is. I didn't think of it. I just took it from somebody else. And that was John Walvoord, now going to be with the Lord, one of probably the top scholar on the book of Revelation and end times prophecy of the 20th century. Professor down at Dallas Theological Seminary. And his comment in addressing this issue is, let the Bible tell you. He said this will solve most of your issues. Let the Bible tell you if you take something literally or figuratively. And literally, for example, when Abaddon, remember when the Apollon or Abaddon is released, it's a star that falls from heaven. So is that an asteroid or a meteor or a comet, or is it something that you don't take literally? And then it says, and he, so we immediately know from that word he, that this is not an asteroid, because an asteroid, you wouldn't have a masculine description. It's a rock. And so he was given the keys to the abyss, and when he opened it up, and these things came flying out, and then it says, and they were like, so you're using an example of something you understand to describe something that you see but do not understand. So they look like little hornets with scorpion tails and riding little horses, and bizarre. Just, I have no idea. There's nothing in my experience that can grasp that, but it's not meant to be literal. But Jesus, when you go down to hell, you go up to heaven. I think there is a literalness that can be taken that way. And you start thinking that, read the book of Revelation with an understanding of heaven being up and Sheol being down. And a lot of things seem to fit. So when he's saying, I'll go down in mourning to the grave, there's a sense of going down. Second thing, they discovered over in Israel burial caves. Something we're very familiar with, that they had a cave that hadn't been used, and they would cut a stone in a round-shaped fashion, and it took several men to push it back. Well, inside all these burial vaults, and some of them were ancient back in Old Testament times, some of them were less ancient, New Testament times. They would open up, and you would go in, and there would be a raised platform of stone. They would dig it out, and then when you went back behind that, it was like the next sort of room, almost like a closet, but open, and it would go down deeper. And what that signified was, if you read in some of the older translations, something they should have kept in the newer translations, when the kings died, it says, and they were gathered unto their fathers. Nobody really knew what that meant. And all of a sudden, one time, they opened up this tomb that had never been opened before, and there's a rake in it. and bones in the back. And so what happened, they were family graves. When somebody died, they would lay them on the table, the raised part at the front. They would shut it up, let all the decomposing, all that stuff take care of itself. And then when somebody else died, they got the rake out and they pushed, or they gathered all the bones to the back. So if you ever hear he was gathered to his fathers, there's a literalness to it. So just something to think about. Those kind of things just fascinate me to no end. So I'm easily entertained. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials and the captain of the guard. And we set the story for that to continue on with David. Famous story. If you've been a believer any length of time, you probably know it. If you're a newer believer, you're in for a treat. It's a great recommendation. If you got teenage kids, get them to read the story of Joseph because of the character of the man, the decisions he made that were right and righteous, and how God blessed him. Same thing with David, and there's other people as well. Just people that you can admire and learn from and have a role model of. And Joseph's probably one of the best role models in the Old Testament and New Testament, just because of his decisions that he made. So I think I'm going to stop there.
What are the call letters of that reading that you recommend? Beginning chapter and ending what?
Oh, chapter 38, verses 1, just chapter 38.
Well, there was before him. I mean, you wanted us to study 38 for next week. Didn't
Yes.
you say that?
Yes.
What about this story of Joseph? It began back here and ends where?
Yeah, and that's, okay, if you just follow me, Joseph is chapter 37, 38 is Judah, 39 goes back to Joseph, the story of Joseph, and goes 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, and then there's more stuff, but you get a lot of great stuff. It's a great story. It's true, and it's an inspiration. So, but great stuff if you have boys or you have responsibility of taking care of. I think a boys 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years can start reading some of that stuff when you get up into the teen years, because there's some adult themes that go on in the scriptures that we need to be somewhat sensitive about, but great inspiration. Any other questions? Thank you, Kara Ann, for reading.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Wonderful. Any thoughts, words of wisdom? Then let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time, and thank you for Joseph's faithful response. You get all the credit, though, Lord. Just the dysfunction that went on in that family, and you still worked through them and used them, and they became the 12 tribes. And what a great thing. Thank you, Lord. Keep us safe, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.